of our success is that we've torn up the script. I said I was going to be sharing things with you, what we'd planned. Let me read, in all honesty. We said, part 2, go back to the panel, try to feed them with questions, let them have responses, and before we go to the Q&A. But what I'm reading from the floor as moderator is that we do have an energy here that can be sustained. And that energy is going to be sustained by you. Because I believe that instead of me asking the questions, the questions are genuinely coming from you. So we've torn up the script, and part 2 is a continuation of Q&As from the floor and Twitter feeds. So I don't know, Karin, whether we're going to go with the Twitter question first, maybe, because that's much more precise.
Maybe we could do that.
And again, a special plea, both for my panel and from the participants, to keep the dynamism, to keep the flow, to have everybody have a voice. Apart from me, who's a sort of special person here who can speak for all day, everybody else... I didn't like my joke. Okay. Everybody, everybody, please, as in any kind of conversation, a minute max for whatever you have to say from everybody will do well, and see how long we can sustain that.
Okay, great.
Karin.
Before I start, I have one question from Twitter, but I also want to open out back to the audience, just to give everybody a sense of Twitter, because some people may feel Twitter, you feel comfortable with Twitter. Other people may still be asking, what is Twitter? I myself, it wasn't long ago, came onto Twitter, myself forced onto it. So I can say also it can be challenging, but one thing I want to make a comment just for me taking on the role of here is in helping moderate and support our moderator here, is we were in the negotiations in New York last year in the SDG post-2015 framework process. And there were some high-level sessions in New York around water. And on that day, water was actually the #1 issue on Twitter. Despite the fact that that day there were actually serious conflicts in certain parts of the world that were very much in that day were a very challenging situation in parts of the world, serious conflicts. And not to downplay the conflicts that are happening in the world, of course, but I think it was a very strong signal that water is rising in the agenda and its importance. And that day that on Twitter water was the #1 topic is something noteworthy, especially for this future generation. As you mentioned, Monsieur Giraud, the people who are now born will be leading us into this next century. They are on Twitter. They're comfortable with these social media aspects. And so I think we need to make sure that we're also taking that into account if we want to stay relevant and put into this process for the long term. So we had a question here from Twitter. One was around this question that came up earlier around leadership, but also around technology transfer and financing for implementation. So if we make a bit of a switch around actually moving toward implementation of SDGs, particularly a dedicated goal on water, and what comes with that, the targets and some of the indicator discussion that happened before, is how do we deal with these issues, particularly the finance one keeps coming up. But I think it was also noteworthy that technology transfer started coming up as well, and how do we take that into account. So that's one I want to highlight from Twitter. But I also want to come back out for those of you after the coffee break, things that have been on your mind to bring back to our panel in this discussion. Is there something? I see a hand right here. Okay, let me run right over here.
Thank you. Does this work? Yeah. My name is Frank van der Valk. I'm with the Water Integrity Network. My question is about the implementation, in fact. It's great to hear the panel talk about very important plans for the future, but as the moderator said in his first introduction, there must be challenges there, and I would like to come back to this issue of governance and the water crisis being a governance crisis. And I think that's pretty obvious. I mean, if just one example, if you look at the state of most of the major rivers in the world, they are horribly polluted. And it's clear that we fail in governing water there. But the question is, how come? And Mr. Giraud pointed out water governance is very complex. Yes, of course. But isn't there more to it than that? And my question relates to the integrity of governance processes. And, are these processes always of sufficient quality? Aren't they being rigged by personal interests which influence the governance more than the actual goals of the formal policy goals there? So my question isn't that a bit of the white elephant in the room, in the governance room? And question to the panel is twofold. One, do you think sufficient attention is being paid to the quality and the integrity of governance processes and the processes which rig these? And secondly, similarly, more concretely on the SDGs, shouldn't there be, when we talk, unfortunately in the water goal, there is not too much mention of governance specifically, but we still have the opportunity of working on the indicators, and shouldn't there be sufficient attention for the quality of governance processes in the indicators, for instance, in terms of transparency, accountability, and participation of the stakeholders?
Thank you very much. If I may introduce just another rule, and because there are lots of us, just one question per person, then we'll keep on going round until the well dries up. Until the well dries up, everybody one question, please. So, sir, if you would.
Yes, Fernando Jauregui from Venezuela.
I can't hear you. I'm sorry.
Hello, Fernando Jauregui from Venezuela. Ecopracticas, a campaign, radio, TV. And I have a question. What is the role of education in water issues to have the backup necessary or pressure on governments and institutions to accomplish all the things we're speaking here today? Thank you.
The role of education.
As I'm walking here, the other one I just want to bring up that came up also on Twitter is what is one thing that the private sector can do to help implementation moving forward in the post-2015 framework. So I think just one I want to call out from Twitter.
Right. I think, Karen, that's good enough for us to move on. And I think of those, because of the preoccupations, I'm going to go to Mr. Moss. Because again, the understanding is, the public sector, the government was all this. What is the role of the private sector? Can we go to you for that? Although it was the last question posed.
Yeah, I'd like to try and answer actually two of those questions. What is the role of the private sector? And the one asked about governance, and I think hidden behind that was the question of integrity. The private sector has many roles to play in different parts of the water sector. The private sector is both a very important consumer of water and a very important deliverer of water and water services. And one of the things that is common across all of that is the development of technologies of all kinds. The private sector is working on developing technologies appropriate to water on the water consumption side, how to consume less, how to produce more product with the same water, how to produce better services with the same water. At the same time, the private service operators are there to improve or help governments improve the quality of the services, to make investments, to bring in new technologies. And the private sector can do all of those things, but it cannot do them, and what's more, it will not do them in the kind of situations referred to by the gentleman from the Water Integrity Network. One of the biggest risks to the private sector is getting involved in situations where there is bad governance, where there is coercion and corruption. It is very difficult for operators or for investors to operate in those situations. And we know, unfortunately, that lack of governance or lack of integrity in governance is a big barrier to investment. I said this yesterday in the panel I was in, the ministerial roundtable. Until we have a combination of good governance, we will not get finance, we will not get investment, we will not get good operation.
Mr. Moss, you're the one who raised the buzzword indicators. So I would like you to continue and say what indicators in this particular regard would please you with your businessman's hat?
I'm not sure that I can actually answer that question with a businessman's hat today. I happen to be involved with Michel Jarreau's team in working on the indicators globally, and therefore I have a view which is partly political and partly practical. Clearly the indicators must work. Clearly they must be very simple for this process. For a business point of view, we want many more indicators, but that's for our own problems, and we've done a lot of work on those. We want 10 simple indicators that enable us, or enable the governments, to measure the 10 measurable components of the 6 targets in the water goal today. And that's what we're looking for.
Monsieur Jarreau, could you take the microphone? We're going to stay with this word indicators just for a while, and the idea of measurable. Now, we've got 10, which is a small number.
Yes.
Could you break it down even less for a lay perception? Measurable around what areas? And again, for my panel, across the board, we're going to look at the measurable indicators. We've heard about education, and there is a quotient there for social cultural inputs. And I read a very cynical article somewhere in The Economist, perhaps, which said you can't measure these things. So why are they there? Measuring things. We're talking about business indicators. Monsieur Jarreau.
Yeah. As Jacques mentioned, we have the 6 targets within the water, at least this is what is proposed, and about 10 indicators. What it means, if you think about 10, is both a big number and also a very small number. With 10, you cannot measure accurately everything you want. So the idea is to select the things which are, in a sense, having the biggest impact or the most meaningful, but at the same time, the one we know how to measure. Certainly, we want to learn the lesson, as was mentioned in the first part of the session by Jack, lessons from the MDG, where we had to end up with proxy indicator because what was proposed was, at the time, not really measurable. Lessons have been learned, and we are learning the lessons for that, so we tried to have a few things. And if you think about the major component of the thing, we still need to measure, of course, safe drinking water. We still need to measure things linked to sanitation. But we also need to measure some of these new aspects about treatment of wastewater, and I could take many examples. And a lot of work has been done because it's not something which is sector-specific. Again, water is cross-cutting. So we have been involving all the members and partners of UN Water, altogether 67. And when I say 67, actually it's more than that, because some of them, like Aquafed, represent all variety of perspective. And we are trying to define this combined indicators. At the end of the day, member states will decide. So we are just here to support the process, to say this is technically feasible. Yes, it can be done. It is technically meaningful, so it will measure something which is meaningful, but it is also true that some aspects like the governance, although they are not absent from the indicator. If you look at the indicator, but that would take me more than the time you have allocated me. Exactly. We have some governance aspect in the indicator, and one thing which I would like to mention, which was not very much mentioned explicitly, but implicitly, yes. We have to be able to address the transboundary governance of things, because when it comes to water, you cannot deal with it in many cases just on a national basis.
Thank you. Mrs. Kakabatse, you talked about the universality of lakes, rivers, and the environment. Again, indicators, measurability. What do those words say to you in this context?
A lot. And I mentioned this initiative of WWF with the private sector to produce these river basin report cards and have it as a tool that you can use in any part of the world, in any river basin, to account for the state of the art of that basin. The goods, the bads, and the uglies that would lead you into action. But I think it's also important to stress the relevance of working together with other sectors. I'm not sure whether you are involving civil society groups in these processes. For us as WWF, it is absolutely essential to teamwork on these processes, on indicators and many other things, because nor the governments, nor the private sector, nor the NGOs have the capacity themselves, or they do have the capacity, but they would be wrong in pretending that that they would come up with a product that is to be used by everybody. So working as a team with all the sectors of society in creating processes that are dynamic, participatory, would lead into having also the governments take public policy decisions. And I want to stress the difference between the public policy and the government policy. We don't want government policies, because at the end of that government, the policy would be dead. We want state policies, public policies that have a never-ending use in terms of time of is an instrument to be used to regulate, to become the court on which we play.
Minister Van Hagen, I come to you. The last comment before the coffee break, you were very concerned. The research that you've done was pointing, it was rather more pragmatic. You knew exactly the number of people who would die, and you took that to people to discuss, and they said, this is how awful it could be. But in the same background reading, countries like the Netherlands, which say we have the most water-secure delta in the world, I still go back to the idea of measurability and indicators. Could you supply the indicators and they would be applicable anywhere in the world? Have you cracked the problem? Is there a panacea for all our problems, and the Netherlands does it?
Wish it was true, but the problems differ. We've got the problem with flooding. We get some drought problems also now in the summers, but most of the time it's flooding. Or intrusion of salt water, for example, in our freshwater systems. And in Africa, the problems are totally different from ours. So you can't just...
So you cannot have universal indicators?
No, you cannot just implement your indicators somewhere else. You can have more universal indicators that can be used by countries and then made special for these countries, more specialized for these countries' problems, because every problem needs a solution that is local or regional. That's, I think, very important. Though I was also thinking on the question on the quality and integrity of governance, because of course this happens everywhere. But when I look at governance problems, I think one of the biggest problems is that you have in so many countries so many ministers responsible for water, always such a small part. When I was in Myanmar, I met, I think, 7 or 8 ministers regarding water. And then the responsibilities on the different levels, regional, local, national. So if we want to have an integrated approach, we should also see that there are less organizations and less people responsible for water, because in the end, someone has to take the responsibility.
Mr. Kasongi, I want to go back to you on this issue, again, of transboundary. Again, we come from the African context. Transboundary, where the state boundaries, the national boundaries, are further compounded by the whole notion of ethnicity. Countries which are going around and saying we have Kenya 47 ethnic groups, Tanzania 257 ethnic groups. When is the microcosm going to become the macrocosm in the African context?